Hello everyone, it is Jack, and first off, ignore big white patch. I have a skylight. Secondly, and more importantly, the topic of this video, how out of date can your language resource be? So in my time of learning languages, specifically Italian, which I didn't do in school at all, I did it mostly by myself at home, I came across many different resources, YouTube videos, news reports, of course learning books. Most of the learning books I got from this century. However, my dad in a charity shop managed to find one from almost the Victorian era, and whilst having different resources from different time periods can be really useful for if you want to try and understand the history of language or about the at the time opinions of people from said country at the time. Like if you wanted to get at the time opinions of Spaniards when Franco died and their country was very quickly ushered into an era of democracy, it would make sense to have resources from the 70s, whether it be TV reports or newspaper articles, and within that you can still learn some language. Like in the past 50 years there hasn't been that much of a shift. I do have a Spanish learning book from the 60s, and the only real difference between that and most of modern day Spanish is words around air travel. Like they were still about going to the aerodrome and flying in a helicopter, and there not really being much infrastructure at the airport. However, this bad boy from the early 1900s that's so old, the front cover is just a sheet of like brown, it looks like a piece of mud. And the price is 1 shilling, I think. It is so old. This thing, it is a time capsule. It is a monument to Italian 100 years ago. And it's not just different attitudes in society and technology that are reflected in this book, but also grammatical setups in both Italian and English, and some different spelling patterns. Like I noticed definitely one big change in common spelling between Italian 100 years ago and nowadays. So the first thing that I noticed that didn't so much horrify me, but shocked me, even though it really shouldn't have, was in the family section of this book. They use quite a few words that today are always considered slurs. It contained the words cripple, lame, dwarf and hunchback. There's no mention of the word disability or wheelchair. I'm actually surprised I didn't see the words like idiot or moron in there. But it's just a reflection of the time. And also the word for dwarf in Italian is so cute, it's nano. Like in English that's just the smallest unit of measurement. But for them it's just a very little person. Very much on this topic of, I guess, inclusivity. Of course, I noticed a lot of just casual sexism in the book. I can't remember how it was set out in the clothing section, but it was very much made clear only a woman was gonna wear an apron, and also lots of mentions of suits and ties and neckerchiefs, washing laundry with starch, which I guess is a technological progression where now we use, I mean, I have no idea what chemicals are in it, but detergent. But then also they had a section that's called religion, and the only religion that gets a mention, that gets a hell of a lot of detail and mention, is Christianity. They mention quite a few words of different members of the church clergy and setup, and different rooms within a church, different types of church, but they don't mention Jews or synagogues or Hindus or Muslims. And at this time, even 100 years ago, Europe still had lots of Jewish communities. Some areas of Europe had way more Jews than they have now. One of those countries actually being Italy itself. But they never got a mention. It was just all about Christianity. And Protestants were just one massive group of Protestants. There weren't any delineation of different groups, which, to be fair, also makes sense that I think at the time Italy probably had more Jews than Protestants. But like, these religions still exist and were still well known to the sort of like upper class person who would be able to afford a trip to Italy and therefore need to buy this book. And that classism really showed through in the entertainment sections. They only mentioned like going to the theatre or the fine art gallery. That was it. The concept of going to the beach or a walk in the park or going to a bar and listening to some local artists didn't exist. Your super fancy rich British person in a three-piece suit who, whilst travelling also, and they knew this as well, all the many words for porters and luggage locker room and how much weight can I take on this train. It was very much for the astute upper class British traveller with tons of luggage, all their finest clothes, going to the fancy cities around Italy to go to the opera and see fine art. And further on to the laundrette, all the phrases in the laundrette section were really negative. Like the laundrette worker had no idea what they were doing. It was just, oh, this is ripped. Oh, there's still a stain here. Oh, you used too much starch, whatever the starch compound was. Did they just rub the stain with a potato? I've actually heard of people doing that. The next one, that it was very much more logical for me and wasn't just a laugh fest. Changes in technology. Of course, there's no TV, there's no telephone. They don't even mention, I don't even think they ever mentioned the radio, but they certainly did mention a telegram and possibly a telegraph pole. And to add to the lack of TV, lack of planes, electric trains, a metro system, and just general lack in modern travelling, because it hadn't come around yet. It was still decades away, and especially youth travelling, there was no section about teenagers and young adults going travelling and staying in a youth hostel and it being a shit show. The main two alternative forms of transport, of course, mentioned were bike and horse, and the bike certainly wasn't anything. I mean, my bike's a bit of a hunk of crap, but the type of bike they're going on about, I'm reading about all these different mechanical parts to it that definitely don't exist anymore. I'm just thinking, how the hell do they have a Tour de France before World War One? That must have been torture. And of course, they had loads of words for your horse, because like you may rent a car today, it seemed back then they would rent a horse. I guess if they wanted to go out into the countryside, I guess it looks a lot more civilized. Even regarding healthcare, I guess, well, obviously our health research and technology has gone leaps and bounds in the past 100 years. So half the conditions listed don't exist. And technology that confuzzled me the most was about the photography. Photography, of course, in these days was very much in its infancy. I think they only invented the first camera about 50 years earlier, and it was slow to progress. Like, you'll be at max taking 4 photos, and you had to keep that camera still, and it was the size of your fucking head. But I never knew that I thought the thing you put in a camera was either called like a slide or a roll of film. They called them plates. I don't know whether it's you put the plate in the slide and then you put it in the lens. They're also writing letters with quires. I don't know, maybe I should get a quire. I mean, all you actually have to do to get a quire is just find a bird feather and dip it in ink. Anyway, all that stuff was expected and made using the book really funny. Also quite an eye-opener to how far technology's come. I even recognise it in my own short life of 27 years. But none of this is really going to trip you up in learning the language. You just learn about the words for stuff that's obsolete. Where it starts to trick you out is where Italian grammar and spelling have changed. The main thing that has pretty substantially changed in the past few decades with Italian grammar is around the third person pronouns. Nowadays, it's lui for him, lei for her, loro for them, and then lola, lile. Quite structured. However, you still find this in old Italian texts, even from like the 50s or 60s, where there are like 4 different words for he, not like across he, him, and all the different positions in a clause, just for he or the direct object of him or them. It's a lot more complex. There's 3 different words with all the different endings, and it's incredibly confusing. And like so many of them became obsolete in different periods, whereas this book seemed to try and list them all. There were also some different words for superlatives, I've noticed. I've generally got used to comparatives and superlatives that are just made with più o meno to be the same as each other. Like better and the best is just both migliore. This one had, I think it had the best as ottimo or massimo, which can generally mean excellent, but to me, it just seemed like a whole new thing to learn that obviously over the decades they saw as pointless. English is one of the few languages that doesn't find it pointless and still has a difference for more and most. And another thing is a little word contesto, which still exists in Spanish, but doesn't in Italian or English anymore. So in Italian, the word for that is just quel or quello, but in Spanish, you can either have ese or aquel, and aquel is that thing quite far in the distance. And that is what quello used to only be. And then ese is that thing sort of in the corner near me. And that is what contesto used to be. And I don't know whether English had a word like that. Anyway, whether we just said that thing over there or that thing right here. But it isn't this thing. And Italian got rid of contesto. I only ever learnt quello. But it turns out it existed, but in Spanish you still got it, although aquel is rarely used. So I guess Spanish is just getting rid of the other one. Who knows, maybe 2050 aquel will be a word of the past in Spanish. Another thing, which is something you learn with a big chart when doing Italian, is when they combine the and the different words for the with a preposition. There are about 6 prepositions in Italian which are like 3 letters long, 2 or 3 letters long. They all combine to make one word. Nowadays there are less of them, but it seems that in this book from 100 years ago, first off, it's typed terribly, but all they are was typewriters, so you can't really blame them. You can't really make a table with a typewriter, but they tried their best, and what I deduced is that con and per were within these prepositions that combined to make new preposition article words. Because for con il, it was col, and for per il, it was pel. But then it was still con la, but then cogli, colle, coi, and then I think they also had pei, as in pei, for the masculine plural things. And I can understand why they discontinued that, because most of them, like al, alla, dal, dalla, you don't actually change the word. Whereas with per, you're just taking one letter away, but half the word's missing. And the same with con. Colle means glue stick. Maybe that hadn't been invented yet? But still, it's confusing and you're erasing half a word because the word is so short. I can understand definitely why that change was made. And the last change I noticed, I guess more spelling than grammar, the letter J in Italian. I remember one of the first things I learned when I was going through the alphabet is there are 5 letters in Italian you only see in foreign words. J, K, W, X and Y. I was kind of surprised. I had to look twice because I and J look so similar, but serbatoio, which means petrol tank, was spelled with a J. It ended OJO instead of OIO, which it nowadays does. Although I must say my favourite grammar thing I noticed with this book was their conjugation on the English side of verbs. They didn't just say, like, if you were doing essere to be, it didn't just say essere to be and then have I, you, he, she, it, and then sono, sei, e. They literally wrote I am, you are, but they didn't write you are. They did for the plural. It was we are, you are, they are. It was thou art. And they did this with every verb. One person in the second person, it was thou in English. Even back then, I thought it was like Tudor English. I didn't realise even 100 years ago they were saying thou art, thou hadst, thou didst. It just reminded me of German, which of course English came from, but we simplified our grammar so much. Now, despite the fact that ideally we should have 4 words for you, whether it's 1 or 70,000 or 3 billion, or it's the subject or the object, it's all you. I actually learned something about the history of my own language. One thing I also learned, as just like a little side note of all this, is the word arpeggio. I learned to play the clarinet when I was in high school, and I remember for my grades I had to learn scales and arpeggios. And it comes with the word harp. I never realised because they were right next to each other in the music section. And harp in Italian, it's almost the same word, it's arpa. And then underneath it said arpeggio. I'd never made that connection before. And also, the lira I have another, I guess you could say historic Italian book, but it's from the 90s. So it's just before the euro came in. The lira, it was a mono-denominational currency. You just had a lira, and that was it. And the lira, over the years, hadn't been recalibrated. It becomes so small. A coffee would be 5,000 lira. But in this book, it's so old that the lira was actually calibrated rather sensibly. And of course they had conversions to pound, shilling and pence. But I think a lira was more than a shilling. The lira was so stable and big that it was separated further. This is just some silly video I wanted to make going through language in oldie woldy times. But the main lesson here is still use these resources, but use them more as a pastime. This isn't genuine language learning. Use it once you feel quite confident. If you find something like this, treat it as a relic and use it once you feel confident with the language. If you're learning a language for the first time, go onto the internet and get the most up-to-date resources you can find, and only look at a book from 100 years ago when you can definitely tell when something is from 100 years ago and has changed since. Anyway, whatever language you are learning, whatever old book you managed to find, I wish you luck with it. I hope you don't end up looking like an idiot while trying to speak your language of choice. And goodbye.